Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 32nd webinar of the Institute of Economic Affairs. The IE is a think tank. We are based in Kenya, and part of our work is to carry out research and present this research in public events such as this to raise public understanding about the key challenges of Kenya's economy, Kenya's paths to growth, and obviously to ensure that conversations around public affairs and economic policy choices are understood by as many Kenyans as are interested. So the IE is a think tank, and we have regular webinars such as this in which we discuss topical issues affecting Kenya's economy. One of the strands of conversations we've been having is tracking Kenya's industrial development journey. And in tracking Kenya's industrial development journey, we ask a number of questions. Some of them, of course, related to what's the state of industry in Kenya, keeping track of government's objectives and government's targets, and trying to report on them and to see what the progress that has been made, but also at the same time, what the challenges are and how these may be resolved. So that's our agenda for the day. My colleague, Leo Kemboi, who's a program officer in our Law and Economics program, has prepared a presentation today based on the title that you see. Today, we are asking about the economic costs of the 2 decades of premature deindustrialization in Kenya. Now, by definition, premature deindustrialization is measured in 2 different ways. One way is basically what's the share of the gross domestic product or value added in an economy that is attributable to industrialization or manufacturing, industry or manufacturing. And then the second one is basically the income level at which industry stops to grow as a share of that or a country's GDP. So that's basically one of the 2 ways in which you look at it. Now, why is that important? That is important for many reasons. One of them, of course, is just the historical one, that traditionally, in the last century, starting from now and going back, the countries that have had the most effective and the quickest transformation in the lives of their people have shown at the same time a structural change in the economy, meaning that most of their people have been graduated from working in small farms and into manufacturing sector. And therefore, manufacturing sector has been defined until now, and I still think it's true, as a major avenue for escalating growth, but at the same time, one for rapid transformation of society. Now, for Kenya's case, Vision 2030, which sometimes forms our second reason, Vision 2030 developed around 2008, was predicated on the idea that we'd be following the example of East Asian countries, especially some Southeast Asian countries, many of whom achieved very high rates of growth and structural transformation of those economies by developing industry as a source of employment, but also as a source of exports because of that reason. For that reason, most scholars call manufacturing as an escalator of growth. Why? Because it allows for the transfer of people, the structural transformation, which is the transfer of a population from predominantly an agricultural population in terms of the share of agriculture in value added, but also the share of populations working in agriculture, which is Kenya's position today. Up to 60, close to 70% of all eligible people in the labor force work in agriculture farms. That's not bad by itself, but basically as one way of raising productivity to move a good part of that population into manufacturing enterprises, which provides an opportunity for them to earn higher incomes, but to connect with other services while at the same time creating exports is assured development policy method. And that's why it's been recommended for many countries. And Vision 2030 was predicated on that assumption as well. You now know that the Vision 2030 and its successor, whatever it shall be, is being subject to scrutiny, of course, a review, with the possibility that it will be succeeded by a new program. But the point is, as we got over those several years since Vision 2030 started, it seems that Kenya did not sufficiently get onto that escalator of manufacturing. And Leo will tell us why. But manufacturing as a share of GDP about 15 years ago, slightly more, was close to 14% of GDP. It has now shrunk to barely 8% of GDP. So part of the reason we'll be asking ourselves here is, how do we know that that has happened? And what does that imply for Kenya's growth and development going forward? And we'll know that, like every development policy, it's extremely hard. But that's not a reason to not do it. To ask ourselves as well is, then what avenues of growth do we have, both for this sector, but for Kenya generally? So I welcome you all to this conversation. My name is Kwame Wina. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And we're going to have this conversation. So I'll allow Leo to come in and ask two things of you. If you have any questions while the presentation is going on, please use the the chat box on the floating bar on your menu to send those questions. At the end of it, I'll consolidate them and I'll ask Leo. But in the meantime, we'll keep all cameras and all microphones. We'll shut all cameras and mute all microphones so that we can have one single presentation. And thereafter, after 25 to 30 minutes of presentation, this will be open to you for questions to you. So on behalf of the Institute of Economic Affairs, welcome again, and Leo, let's have the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kwame. So as Kwame has explained, that this is part of an ongoing series that we call the Industry254. And the bigger conversation about this is to look at specific policy questions around Kenya's manufacturing. So one of these is to just document the economic costs of the 2 decades of deindustrialization, premature deindustrialization in Kenya. So today we'll focus on explaining the concept. We'll have a small methodological note. We'll establish the baseline. We'll show the counterfactual, and then also show what economic costs as that premature deindustrialization cost, and then ask ourselves in the end, what should this mean for policy? So generally, if you look at the premature deindustrialization, this is a concept that was developed by an economist called Danny Roderick, a Harvard economics professor. But for this case, we want to show that there are two. You can explain it in 2 ways, like some sort of 2 senses. One being that countries can reach premature deindustrialization, as Kwame has explained, in 2 ways. In 2 ways. One, it can be in the sense of income, and then on the second level is the sense as a premature in level. One, that some countries reached premature deindustrialization at the level of $10,000 to $14,000. Now we're using 1990 numbers. Second, it can some others have done it at a turning point of 8,000 to 9,000, and that is for many countries in emerging markets and developing economies. The second sense is it peaks at 30 to 45% for early industrializers. These are countries that became industrial nations between 100 and 150 years ago. But today, you find that majority of countries peak around 13 to 15%, like the case of Kenya, for example. So either way, when it becomes premature in income and in premature in the level, the policy fixes for the two are different. So for example, if it's premature in income, you find that you'll need to find the policy fix would be on the competitiveness, costs, dealing with the issue of costs, expanding market access. And so the second part is, if it's premature in level, the ceiling itself, you will not be able to meet the ceiling itself. So the feasible policy should to deliver that 20% manufacture that 20% manufacturing as a share of GDP would now to be structurally change the subsectors of manufacturing. That means to find more capacity or industrial upgrading and many others. So the policy fix is different. So like for the case of Kenya, as we've indicated in red, is to find superstars. And these superstars are farms that, like for example, the EABL, the breweries, these are farms that have bigger output. They have very highly productive workers. They also, it requires larger component. It has a bigger supply chain. It has a bigger value in terms of value add, manufacturing value add. It's one of the largest. So to find those superstars that can structurally change the manufacturing sector. So for the methodological note is, there are key things that we see from the data. One is that between 2005, the year 2005 is our baseline because that is the year that the manufacturing started, as a share of GDP started coming down. So the level changed. So that becomes our baseline. So between 2005 and 2025, manufacturing grew at 3.2% on an annual basis. While on the same period, the GDP grew at 4.7%. So that in itself, on a yearly basis, there was a 1.5 percentage point negative gap for a single year, every single year. So what we want to do is to create an identity. What we do is to hold the 2000 and the trajectory at 10 at the 2005 trajectory, the manufacturing trajectory at constant, while at the same time compare it with the actual numbers, so that we are able to see what is the foregone value had. So we don't want to build, in this case, we didn't want to build a model or do estimation or do priors. We want to just see if Kenya had kept that upward trajectory, upward trajectory, and then compare it now with that. And then the second thing is to, again, be able to do some sensitive, what we call, economists call sensitivity analysis, be able to account for the way the structure of Kenya's economy is. And then now be able to look at these losses in form of what did it do to outputs, what did it do to formal jobs, what did it do to tax revenue, foreign exchange, and then lastly, foregone productivity convergence. So the first part is to establish the baseline. So one thing that you notice is, so if for example, it had kept the same phase in 2005, that would be 10.45% manufacturing shares of real GDP. So the one in the green line is the actual numbers, the manufacturing as a share of GDP as it is, and then the one in purple is our counterfactual. A counterfactual is just a way of saying what if, accounting now for the what if. So between the green and the purple line, this is the foregone value. This is the opportunity cost of manufacturing as a share of GDP of that premature deindustrialization. So this will be our baseline. So we'll be trying to estimate these costs and what these costs mean for output, jobs, foreign exchange, and many other things. But one thing that we note is that in constant prices, it has declined at 2.63% percentage points. Then the one part of it is we wanted to confirm that what are some of those price level effects. So roughly one quarter of that number has come from from the decline in manufacturing relative price. So no real volume was lost. It's just that because the manufacturing sector did not grow at a prior pace, expected value did not yield. So we compare current prices in green, and then constant prices, and then we see that after the economy was rebased in after 2015, that the current prices were lower than constant prices. So is from the Rodrigues paper, the usual measure of the industrialization is that real output, measure of the industrialization, changes in real output confound with changes in real relative prices. And then we compare globally. So one thing that we notice, on an average, countries that prematurely deindustrialized averaged 15.6 at 4,000 at 15.6 as a share of GDP, and then at 4,000 around $4,000, $4,120. But you find other early industrializers, early industrializers average at 36% at 36 percent of GDP at $10,000. But you see the usual suspects that the UK, Germany average at 45%. At around $11,000, Germany around 42, closer to $12,000 mark. United States 30%, around $10,000. Japan around $12,000, 30% again. All of them you see in that similar trajectory. But where you see Kenya, it's around 13.5%, closer to 15% mark at $1,300. And then thereafter, manufacturing as a share of GDP has kept on falling downwards. So you see that it industrialized early. Kenya deindustrialized early relative to the rest of the others in advanced economies and also the emerging markets. So another thing to again note is this is a comparison between the manufacturing value add of Kenya and some countries in advanced economies and also others in some of the world's best performers in industrialization. So like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Korea, and others. So you notice that this is just comparison, the changes in manufacturing value add between the 2010 and 2023. That is a 13-year period. So you notice that while some other countries gained as high, like Vietnam, 10 percentage points in manufacturing value added more as a share of manufacturing value add, Kenya was the largest. Fall was the largest in the regional sample, and then you see those differences. You see that differences. So Find others like Brazil, South Africa, Malaysia, Chile, to nominal in the within the EAC region. The declines were nominal. So that is Uganda, Tanzania, and Egypt. But you see the others like Bangladesh, Ghana, Nigeria added between 2.2 percentage points to 10.9 percentage points. So these are a very clear illustration that it's not just as a share of the level, but also in terms the value add, the manufacturing value add, it was the lowest. So then we now use 2025 values, 2025 values to calculate 2025 values to restate to 2025 values to calculate what is the cumulative foregone manufacturing value add. So you find that a loss of 25 point, that the entire on a year-to-year basis, Kenya's manufacturing sector would be 2 in 2025 if it had kept up with the counterfactual, the counterfactual, which is a national growth of around 10% as a share of GDP. The manufacturing sector would be 2.6 times larger than what it is today. Then that cumulative loss per household is around Kenya shillings 61,539 on a per capita basis. So this is a substantial sum. The Kenyan economy would be 2.63% large as a share in 2025 numbers. That cumulative loss would be 2.63% of Kenya's GDP. So it's a substantial number. So this is that is the economic cost over those 20 years. 20 years. Again, so we have this thing that we call in economics the Fedun law, VERDOON, and that law is that it was started by a Dutch economist who created an identity that a proportionate growth in output leads to a proportionate growth in labor. But again, what we know is that the other sectors that have higher productivity or have a bigger sway in the economy, like agriculture, and they play a bigger role. So when we account for that 462 billion loss on an annual basis that we've showed in this previous chart, and compare it with now, when we account for the sensitivity analysis for that relative productivity, we find that that the net loss is closer to 1.18% or Kenya shillings 318 billion in 2025 numbers. And then another bigger question that we see from that data is that if you look at manufacturing value add, first the ratio between the share, now if you decompose formal sector workers and informal sector workers in manufacturing, the ratio is like 9.3 to 1. So for every one formal sector manufacturing worker, there are others, for every 10, there are others 99 out of 100. One for everyone, there are others 9 more additional, more informal sector workers. But you see that the bigger issue is even that when you take the value add per worker is around Kenya shillings 3.2 million for formal sector manufacturing worker. But when you account for the both formal and informal sector manufacturing workers, the manufacturing value add falls from 3.2 million to 312,000 shillings. So that's a very big productivity gap. So it shows that manufacturing absorbed labor, yes, but it's absorbed labor into informality. So, 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 so this premature industrialization has led to more informalization of jobs. So that's one of those biggest issues that we see from these numbers. Again, one of the things that you also notice is when we examined the export price index that is published by Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, KNBS, in the annual economic survey, we noticed that the price index has fallen by between 2023 to 2025, just to use that illustration, has fallen by between 183 to 138. That shows you that more exports are, are happening, yes. The volume is happening, yes, but the value, the relative value is still a problem. And again, this reconciles with the number. If you look at Kenya's top exports now, all of them are still what we are considered as primary. If you look at the economic complexity index, all of them are still considered as primary. Because Kenya is selling more, Kenya is selling more, but again, it's still primary products. So it's not moving upward in the value chain. Now we ask ourselves, what does this mean for policy? And the biggest question that is at the takeaway are two questions. One is that the manufacturing value add for value add is low. The manufacturing value add is low for workers, and there is a big productivity gap between formal and informal workers. The second question is, if you take a quadrant and the upper side being the positive part, where higher income and then the level as a share of GDP is higher, Kenya's performance in the last 20 years has been in the negative. So this is where you put Kenya in the with lower income, but also the level as a share of GDP is not matching up to the because of that premature industrialization. So those are two key things, and that is what we'll be asking ourselves: how should that inform policy? One, given the fact that there needs to be to fix the productivity gap between formal and informal workers, and that needs to come. For example, is it a question of human capital? How should skill development respond? Second is one of the things that you also notice from if you look at Kenya's GDP decomposition, is manufacturing, the gross capital formation, and also generally the gross investment rate is not matching up to what the peers should be. So you find that there is the ideal rate for Kenya for investment rate as a share of GDP should be around 33 to 35% as a share of GDP. It's close at the moment, it's after that. So FDI is a big question, and FDI has a big implication to how farms adopt technology, how farms adopt tools, how farms catch up with global productivity possibility frontier, how farms are able to compete in the global value chains. Another question is now that the real manufacturing as a policy goal for the national treasury should be higher than the annual GDP. That should be higher than the annual GDP. And then that question about the productivity gap, there need to be formalized that, because the way you look at manufacturing sector as a two-sided market is that they are incomparable. So it needs that level of formalization to meet the two, to match match those two markets is a question that policy needs to consider. Then the bigger question is that productivity gap. So the way you only deal with productivity gap is to provide for a productivity diagnostic, which is to look at all these subsectors of manufacturing together compared to with them manufacturing and be able to see what supply side drivers or demand side drivers that needs to be fixed that could actually improve productivity. Again, another thing that a committee in parliament should be formed because members of parliament decide a lot of Kenyan law and Kenyan policy that actually predetermines that determines the extent of manufacturing growth. So that committee in parliament would be the one that receives that productivity diagnostic that ensures that that industrial policy is performance linked to specific targets, how to raise skills, what to be able to make look at those market surveys, what is happening in the labor market, and be able to propose solutions to some of those things. To raise export intensity means to raise export promotion, and again to deliberate from time to time and be able to convene the public for the purposes of how policy could be improved. Lastly, as I wind up, some of the key things that you notice from this is public goods, like for example, if you look at Kenya's manufacturing geography, you can situate it in largely more than 70% of it in 4 counties, which is Nairobi, accounting for more close to 40% of all Kenyan manufacturing, around 37% of all Kenyan manufacturing. And then the satellite cities of Machakos, satellite counties of Machakos, Kiambu, and then Mombasa. You take those 4, they explain largely Kenyan. And part of the reason why you see those 4 is, again, if you compare those counties in terms of public service, public goods provision, like things like sewers and many others are more than important. So that level, that concentration has given these counties a go ahead. So it means that public goods provision needs to be a thing that is considered for the entire for the entire country. Then the openness of the economy. Things that destroys competitiveness are things like foreign exchange or policy that do not support FX. If FX is managed, for example, there's an opportunity cost to that FX management, or policies that do not support FDI, or tariffs that support protectionist measures, or so any form of policy that opens up the Kenyan economy that disciplines competition, that allows firms to integrate with global value chains and be able to compete is a policy measure that would be supported. And then discipline incentives. So we've looked at among the things that when we were preparing for this, we looked at some studies, including the one by the World Bank in 2016, is they found out that while you could find Kenyan firms that can compete in upper and middle income economies, places like Chile and other European and close to half of all European countries, you find that there are other Kenyan farms that require state policy to survive. So that is destroying competitiveness. So that Parliament needs to discipline incentives. So those farms are called laggards. Those farms that actually require state support to survive. And then part of the Vision 2060 largely even though they've set aside what should be the growth trajectory, should also be on fixing those productivity gaps, because those are stark differences. You find that if you have more employees in the manufacturing employees in the informal sector, and those employees, so it's like a fertile kind of it's like you find that there is a small share of formal sector workers who are very highly productive, and then you find a bigger share of them who are not able to. So that productivity gap is something that that needs to be dealt with. The last one is on finding superstars. Superstars. So it's again imperative on policy, so that you don't just have one firm that does well. It's a form of saying that a target of, for example, of the magnitude and scale and size. So you see, like a superstar is a firm that, and to use another example here, like the EABL, to use the EABL example, you find that it's not just one farm. There are many contract farmers, more than 100,000 contract farmers, bottle manufacturers, the people who do the caps, the people who do maintenance, the people who do a lot of, so uh, like there are many other firms along that supply chain. So because manufacturing is structured around supply chains, so to find more of those superstars, and in as many of them, and in many other subsectors of manufacturing, so that helps a lot that creates that distinction that will help a lot in setting the pace and be able to reverse that cause of premature deindustrialization. Thank you so much. Back to you, Kwame.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Leo. So let me try and sum up what he said in a couple of minutes. So the first is basically what is premature deindustrialization, and it can be measured in two ways. The first is when countries seek to develop manufacturing sector or the industry as a share of GDP. Premature deindustrialization is that outcome where a country or a territory's manufacturing sector's production as a share of GDP starts to reduce before it reaches a level that was basically, a level that many other developed countries have now achieved. So in Kenya's case, it peaked at 14% of GDP, close to 14% of GDP, and since then has gone back now to clearly just slightly under 8% of GDP. And it's considered premature because that's even before the income levels have reached levels matched by those countries that had that started the industrialization journey. So it's basically and that's why it's called premature. The second bit is on at income level. At what income level does a country start to reduce? And in Kenya's case, it's one of the lowest, but Kenya is not just the lowest at $2,000 or slightly less than, slightly higher than $2,000, but the reduction in percentage points of GDP of the peak to where it is now is more than 4.1% of GDP, which is higher than any other country, showing that Kenya's premature deindustrialization is more acute than many more countries in this set of data that Leo showed to us. So Kenya is in a place in which premature deindustrialization has happened, but it's also more acute and it's happened at a lower level of income. So those are two very, very important structural problems. And why is manufacturing important? If I repeat, part of that is basically the development journey of most countries has been about moving populations and people from agriculture, and moving the population and employment from agriculture to manufacturing and obviously to services over time. So it's basically like a structural journey, and it's structural transformation because it's changing the nature of employment, but it's also changing where economic output largely comes from. That is the example that has been followed by all countries, starting with the industrial revolution in Europe, specifically the UK, and more recently by the constricted or telescoped, basically, industrial development that occurred in what we call Southeast Asia. So we're talking here of countries such as, of course, it happened in Japan, it happened in Korea, it happened in Taiwan, China to an extent, and a few other countries in that Asian continent. So that's basically the idea. It is therefore desirable and a good and prudent economic policy goal to seek to expand manufacturing at low levels of income because it, one, provides an opportunity for new employment, greater output per person, which means employment and incomes will grow, the possibility of exports and embedding an economy into global value chains. So that's basically it, and that structural transformation is desirable. And then we come to Kenya's numbers, and it shows us that it happened much later. I mean, not only did Kenya and Kenyan countries and African countries start it late, but their industrialization is also ending at a much lower level. And there is no precedent in the world of countries that have developed entirely by leapfrogging this manufacturing phase. So that shows that the development path for a country such as Kenya will be extremely, or suggests that it's very difficult. And then Leo takes us back to a couple of things that measure that. So you can tell one of them, of course, is it's a global phenomenon that has happened. Danny Rodriguez studied it quite a bit, providing those measures. And then coming down to Kenya, so what does it imply? It implies that Kenya's manufacturing growth is going to be difficult. It is still necessary, and it's still the path that is most known and is more probable, but it's going to be difficult because of domestic conditions. One other thing that Leo showed is that if you look at Kenya's manufacturing, it has the highest income per worker in the modern manufacturing sector, or what we call the formal manufacturing sector, an output per worker of 3.2 million per person per year, which is 10 times what the income per capita is. So basically that confirms the idea about manufacturing being a higher value add sector, right? Relative to agriculture, for instance, and other sectors. But if you split that and decompose the entire manufacturing sector from the modern manufacturing sector or the formal manufacturing sector and the informal manufacturing sector, that average comes down from $3.2 million, 3.2 million Kenya shillings per person, which is 10 times the income per capita, and comes down to the level that is just about the income per capita. In other words, the capabilities and the productivity of the average person in the formal sector in manufacturing and the informal sector in manufacturing is so vast. Bear in mind that almost 90% of those work in manufacturing work in the informal sector, telling you that there is a big productivity problem in the informal manufacturing sector. So that's part of the problem that Kenya needs to solve. Not just the one of moving people into manufacturing, but more especially moving everybody into the formal manufacturing side, or vastly improving the productivity of those in the informal manufacturing side. Now, since there are big numbers there, any change that is positive in that level is going to lead Kenya to both two things. One, the growth factor, which is basically the manufacturing output, is going to rise, but at the same time, it's going to raise the share of manufacturing in global GDP, I mean, in Kenya's gross domestic product. So that's the structural component. A couple of policy questions that Leo has then proposed. One, obviously, is public goods provision. We see the importance of public goods provision as inevitable. And sometimes it is possible that inadequate or differential access to public goods provision may actually limit productivity in the informal sector manufacturing, even delaying the possibility of there being formalized enterprises. If you look at the manufacturing geography, it tends to be in Kenya's biggest agglomerations, right? Which is Nairobi and surrounding counties, Machakos on one side, Athi River, and then of course Thika and Kiambu County. And then we have the biggest city, which is close to the port, Mombasa. So all these responsible for about 60%, close to approaching 70% of Kenya's manufacturing, tells us not only that manufacturing tends to be concentrated in specific areas that have certain conditions, but also that the urbanization and infrastructure build definitely affects the ability to build, to construct manufacturing. And then Leo concludes by some of the things that might have to be done is basically, how does Kenya, in terms of policy, try to fix the question about what are the most efficient manufacturing firms and how can they be helped to expand or replicate their successes in other places? I mean, the easy answer is it's going to be difficult. and yet it's a necessary one that needs to be made and to be done. We know that Danny Roderick keeps saying that it appears that globally manufacturing has been coming down because the average global manufacturing as a share of GDP is about 15%. Kenya is at half that, so perhaps there's more scope for Kenya to rise. And that's something that can be fixed by a policy response. And so getting those right policy responses, the taxation, allowing inputs, raising the quality of the manufacturing, the manufacturing worker. So part of it is labor policy questions and capital development. The others are infrastructure. And of course, the other is basically allowing for inputs that allow for the general quality of the manufacturing output to be developed to be much, much better. And then coming to Vision 2030 and to 2060. So it's clear that the Vision 2030 growth rate was about 4.7% when the contemplated part was about 10. So it was barely half of what was contemplated. It's clear that the absence of manufacturing growth or that shrinkage in manufacturing growth explains it. Leo tried to tell us what the consequences of that development is, and we could tell that judging by the numbers in 2025, had manufacturing grown at 10% of GDP, which was basically the benchmark here in 2015, then GDP in 2025 would have been 2.5 percentage points larger. That's not immaterial. That's a really, really big amount. And of course, while he strips it out by claiming that not all that could be attributed to manufacturing in terms of value, but still it comes down to a very big amount. So telling us that the opportunity cost or the price that has been paid for manufacturing not growing in Kenya has been large in terms of jobs, in terms of input to other sectors, in terms of income, obviously, in terms of revenues to government as well. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope I've summarized it well. The presentation will be made available to all of us. I've tried a quick summary so that we can open these to a question and answer. So how do we go about that? We'll open up these to question and answer, and we'll allow you to raise your hand using the raise your hand facility on the toolbar. You raise your hand, I'll point to you. You'll be unmuted. Your microphone will be switched on and you'll be allowed to ask questions. But at the same time, I see in the Q&A box, there's some questions here from Brenda. Brenda asks 2 questions. I'll ask Leo these before we have other people ask questions. What is the government plan to address this problem of premature deindustrialization? So Brenda asks that one question. And then the second is what kind of opportunities and risks does this portend for financial institutions in the MSME sector? So those are 2 questions, Leo. If you can go ahead with those fast. I've seen another point by John. So she asks, she says, this is a great presentation to IEA. Thank you, Leo. Deindustrialization is something we must be concerned about owing to its contribution to economic growth in a wholesome sense, as clearly outlined in your presentation. The question, however, is what will be the impact of automation, also known as AI, for the sector? I'm thinking about the 2060 economic blueprint. So we have 3 questions from ladies. Thank you very much, ladies. What is the government's plan? Leo, please listen to Brenda's to address the problem of premature deindustrialization. The second one is what kind of opportunities and risks does this portend for financial institutions in Kenya? And then the other question from Joanne is basically how does AI and rising automation impact the sector? And what are its implications for the vision, for the economic blueprint 2060 that Kenya will be starting to prepare? So Leo, back to you.
Yes, thank you, Kwame. Thank you, Brenda, for the question. One of the things, the government of Kenya's policy, if you look at various budget documents and other policies, you find that they recognize that they don't call it premature deindustrialization, but they recognize that government has not been able to raise manufacturing share as a share of GDP to 15%. And that if government had raised that, if government had provided a policy environment that provides that 15% of share of GDP, it would reverse that premature industrialization. But So if you look at coherence, we don't see that kind of coherence in resolving the problem. So we haven't seen like a very coherent policy problem related to that, because, like, for example, like the bigger question that the IE has spoken for many years now is the question of tax policy. And remember that sense one, which is the income part, is determined largely by competitiveness, costs, and markets. But you still see government's policy, tax policy has not been coherent. It's not been predictable, and that has a bigger problem with manufacturing, because a manufacturing plan has an 8-year horizon. You take in assumptions. So minimum, that's why you can't see large investment that concretizes, because many manufacturers take an 8-year planning horizon. And if they take certain assumptions and those assumptions change every year, then it becomes a big hindrance. So we don't see that plan. So I cannot give, from the reading government policy documents, a very coherent answer to that. But what we know is that they recognize and they said that at least 15% of GDP should be manufacturing. That's the intended goal. So what kind of opportunities and risks does this portend for for financial institutions? Uh, Partly, the bigger challenge is so, like, if export intensity from manufacturing goes down, you see larger movements in the FX market. That volatility affects financial sector. So if you forgo revenue because manufacturing is premature industrialization days. So from first principles, there are many causes, there are many risks, but there are many risks. On the opportunity side, you could see that on the opportunity side, you could see that opportunity side, you could see that there are what we call the niche sectors. So there are those sectors. If you look at Kenya's entire manufacturing, it's categorized into 3 areas. One, which is a larger part, which is what we call the low complexity tire, which is that low complexity manufacturing, which accounts for almost 60% of all manufacturing produced. And then there's a middle tire, which is around 29%. And then there's the other 10% tire, which is the high complexity manufacturing. Those are areas in the middle and the higher manufacturing sector that financial institution could consider. So those are the risks and the opportunities. So on the question by John, what the impact of automation is, part of when we looked at the literature, and Commerce has alluded to this, is when we looked at the literature, part of closing that productivity gap between those in the larger share of workers in the informal sector and those in the formal sector is to provide those digital goods, those digital components, but also that the tooling to provide that kind of tooling. And that is something that we think would be a positive. So the automation would be a positive impact. So we've not developed because we are still looking at the benefits of AI, AI in this case, the LLMs, the large language models, and the agentic models. One of the things that we still see is that for many repetitive tasks, that AI will play a bigger role in eliminating. But in terms of problem solving and the things that require the kind of original thinking that is required in, say, on a factory floor, labor productivity will still be a bigger question. But what we see is to close that productivity, the availability of automation and allowing these workers in the informal sector to catch up with those in the formal who are considered highly productive, that is where AI would play a positive impact. Thank you. Back to you, Kwame.
All right. Thank you. So I hope you answered Brenda's question about what does this portend for financial institutions and the government's plan. But let me add about the AI question. So let's remember that AI is capital. Capital is, or rather, economics theory, but it's also empirically sound. Capital is usually scarce in low-income countries, partly because people have less lower income. Savings might be high, but capital is still very highly is scarce because of the needs. And what's more available and abundant is labor. So for a country like Kenya, there are very few sectors for which you can actually substitute people's capital for labor. There are some, obviously, but not very many for which that would be possible and work successfully. So for instance, most of the labor in Kenya is basically is still employed in agriculture. And I don't see that we'll be able to have, I know that tractors exist and all that, but I don't see that we'll be able to have agriculture that is entirely driven by robots and all that in a short time. That just would not be possible, but even if it was, it would require such high productivity that the payoffs to justify that payoff. So that's the first reason. The second one is, yes, coming to manufacturing. Yes, we have manufacturing sectors in Kenya. Most of manufacturing in Kenya, and the most effective ones are basically in the areas of food, and just basically food, right? And food items. It's still far away, some distance before we can see manufacturing working, say, for instance, in Kenya's largest industrial crop, which is sugarcane. It is possible to automate that, but as you can tell already, as well, the planting side and the harvesting is still very driven by human labor. So they tend to be still very labor intense. So yes, we need to think about what areas. It is possible that in some areas, manufacturing, labor could be replaced efficiently with AI. But what that does tend to happen is it opens up new opportunities or require an upgrading of people's skills to be able to work in other sectors. But as our premature industrialization told us, in Kenya's case, it has not been driven in any way by AI. In fact, it happened before the opportunity for AI or actually higher capital investments would elevate or displace human labor. So my guess is that that's something for us not to worry about too much yet. But still, it's not zero. Basically, it'll be in other sectors. We saw banking replace tellers or some people with ATM machines a couple of years back. And that's true, but that was already a sector that was very highly capital intensive. Now, we'll come for a second set of questions. So ladies and gentlemen, once again, we welcome your questions. Leo would be glad to answer. Any comments or questions that you have, please raise your hand, or you can type it in the chat box. I've checked the chat box now, and there's just one more question here. So the question is from Emmanuel, and it says, what should the Kenya Association of Manufacturers advocate for as an urgent priority within this context of premature industrialization? In other words, given this context and some of the data that's been presented and the narrative that Leo has traced for us, what do you think that the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, which is basically the equivalent of it's the Confederation of Kenyan Industry, what should be their policy posture, or what should be the content of their policy discourse with government, right? And in the public, given the advantages, and rather given the challenge of premature industrialization that Kenya faces today. Leo, please go ahead.
Yes. So one of the key things that you see from this premature industrialization is there's this question that people ask: where did the rain start beating us? So there is need for what we call a productivity diagnostic, which is to look at global value chains, look at the place of Kenya in those value chains, look at the policy environment, look at what fixture, what policy fix is needed where. And that is an empirical exercise. That's not a political, it's not something we call. So part of the thing is to commit Parliament and to commit the Ministry of Industry, the State Department for Industrialization to undertake a similar thing on or that productivity diagnostic, and then invite, because our constitution again values public participation, invite the members of public to give to participate in that process. That would provide what needs to be fixed, that kind of national conversation. So that framing and to bringing that this issue, a policy correction pathway, is something that I think CAM should advocate. So that is the bigger takeaway for me, because that empirical exercise would yield specific uh, issues that needs to go on a policy correction pathway. That in itself would provide that productivity diagnostic, and then again it's to think about institutionalizing the place of manufacturing, the place of manufacturing in Kenya's policy discourse. Remember, you'll see all forms of associations and unions meeting with members of parliament on policy questions. So, for example, those ones in the tourism sector, you'll see them, the hoteliers, the and farmers, like you'll see. So, but we need an institutional mechanism in parliament. So, for example, a subcommittee, maybe a subcommittee could be considered that deals with specific issues related to manufacturing. So that subcommittee would be thinking on an annual policy process on an annual basis, what needs to, and even be able to they can call for evidence, they can call for ministers to testify, other independent bodies like the central bank to testify. Out, for example, it's like MPC decisions or related to or certain policy goals, like, for example, managing effects affecting manufacturing. So those are things that, thinking about it in an institutional, that kind of a framework, because that diagnostic would give you solutions, but that needs to be updated from now up to now from time to time. So thinking about it as a one-off, like, for example, at the beginning of every administration or during that ad hoc engagement with finance committee on issue of taxes, is not a solution to me per se for the long term. It's something that's an ad hoc, it's ad hoc from time to time, but to deal with the ambition, the goal, and where Kenya is now on manufacturing is something that needs a little bit more of thinking, and that productivity diagnostic could help. Thank you. Back to you, Kwame.
All right. I don't see any other questions. Does anyone else have any other question? Okay. Yes, so there's another question by Emmanuel here. Thanks, Emmanuel. He says, what do you think a serious candidate would float as a policy plank in direct response to deindustrialization? Is there some value a candidate or policy maker may pursue that an association of manufacturing may not necessarily pursue, perhaps at the same pace? And then the second question, is there a direction that the policymaker might take that the CAM may not necessarily prioritize, such as short-term versus long-term horizon? A caveat here, perhaps. And you're asking is there a possibility that where the interest of industrialization and the interest of the manufacturing sector may clash? Okay, Leo, that's a big loaded political economy question, but I think it's still important for us to bear it here to hear your response.
Yes. So one thing, just to make people to take note, is that's a member business organization. They carry interest of their members. So that is a very important thing to notice. So if you look, like, for example, the 2016 World Bank paper on that there are firms that are laggards that require state support to survive, you not necessarily that is something that if somebody was to think about that, how to discipline incentives in parliament, that is something policy needs to go. But that is not something that might be supported by those member business organizations. Secondly, for Kenya to be as one of those solutions to deal with premature deindustrialization, we've provided a claim that openness of Kenyan economy, and that openness has a lot of things to affect with FDI and many other things. But if you look at the rhetoric across the country, not just for CAM alone, but for many other member business organizations, the key thing is a protectionist kind of view. And that is something that only policymakers, in this case, members of parliament, would provide a direction that takes a public interest view rather than the interest that interest. So that is a direction that policymakers would take that those member organizations might not prioritize. Also, what a serious candidate would propose would float as a policy plank. There are many people who don't believe in mass manufacturing jobs, but we still think that the reason why, for example, agricultural sector in Kenya employs a bigger number of people is because the agro-processing component of Kenyan manufacturing is large. So it's not a serious candidate needs to think about those two things: mass manufacturing jobs, fixing the productivity, fixing productivity gap between formal and informal sector, formal and informal sector, and then manufacturing workers. And then the third issue should be for that candidate to think about the policy environment. So for example, should we need a finance bill, or should we have specific tax edges changing that frequent, or the way should, like one of the complaints that we've had from CAM is that you'll find one sector being regulated, one farm being regulated by 18 different regulators. Yes. So those are some of the practical things. So that candidate needs to do some sort of like a symposium to surface those questions and be able to so this, and one thing that we really need to avoid is, and that is the persuasion that myself and Kwame had when we started this Industry254, is that we find a lot of generic policy text on this question. So we want people to think about very specific issues when it comes to manufacturing. So another question that you asked is places in the interest of industrialization and the interest of manufacturing sector, the long term and short term. Yes, so those are things that, and even the way policymakers, there is policy document tools already account for that. So for example, you are required, a policymaker is required, when they change policy is required to do what we call a regulatory impact assessment, especially when the policy is changing substantially the lives of Kenyans. So that is where those places would be, and that public discussion would help a lot in refining that. Yeah, thank you. Back to you, Kwame.
All right. Okay. So, Leo, just before we close, ladies and gentlemen, we're closing the debate. We'll still have time, but I have a question of my own as well. For me, premature industrialization or not, because there's a part of it that cannot be controlled by the government of Kenya, but there's a big part of it that is in the government's hands. If I worked in a government and I was looking at a sector, and you're calling this the manufacturing sector, regardless of what people are manufacturing, and the labor productivity in value add is that wide, that in itself would be a problem, in my view. That's a first thing. So what I'd like to ask you, Leo, is to ask us, what's, maybe we know the causes, or perhaps we do not, but how do you think government should have a productivity so that it should not even just be a manufacturing sector policy? We should actually have a productivity enhancement policy. Because if you have one sector that employs 9% of the total population, I mean, of the total employees, but the wages at that level is, or rather, not just the wages, but the productivity at that level is more than 10 times the average for the entire sector. Then that means that the majority of that sector is a very low value sector. No wonder it's been shrinking at a small one. How does this get, how do you reduce that variance, right? For instance, because yes, it's possible that at the very high level, it's very capital intensive manufacturing, but how do you get to try and squeeze that gap between them? So that's the first one. The second thing is related to the export processing zones and special economic zones. And one of the things that has been happening among county governments and the national government has encouraged is for counties to set what they call the special economic zones, where they establish everything. And it has been realized, and I think that's part of related to it, is that the places that we call the special economic zones or the export processing zones in Kenya have very high productivity by Kenyan average and sometimes measure very well. So the point I'm asking you is, why can't we just have the same policy that applies to the EPZs throughout the country, so that we do not have the distortion of this? If you manufacture in Siaya County, then you are not subject to a special economic zone policy. And if you manufacture in a different, because I think the difference that is also emerges from the fact that the manufacturing sector in Kenya does not have the same policy foundation. Because if you're manufacturing for EPZs, you have an entirely different structure. And if you're why should that structure really exist? And then the third question is, what do you think the effect of a very complicated tax system in this form of VAT has on the growth of manufacturing? You mentioned, and correctly, that most of Kenya's manufacturing is the food sector. And the food sector has very little, in some cases, lower, especially basic foods have low or no VAT or exempt or that complicated edifice. What would a standardized rate of VAT that applies to everybody, regardless, imply for how manufacturing would develop, or how manufacturing assets would be rearranged?
Yes, yes. The first question is something we've deliberated, and it's a very difficult question, because it needs that gap in between the formal sector and the informal sector is so substantial that even it's just ungodly. So that in itself it's a reflection of many things: the human capital, level of skills. So it's a reflection of how technology is deployed, because part of it is in other parts of the world. If you look at the literature, technology allows that catch up between the informal and formal sector workers, and then it's a question of investment. Firms need to deploy and be able to, for them to be more efficient, to deploy capital, and that is a question of investment, which also is again ties back to credit, and that how they obtain credit, how they're able to finance those that capital deployment. So you see, once you start to think about these problems, is that you end up with a very long list of things that need to be fixed. But there are critical things that we can have, say, 5 buckets that you can bring together. One of them being the fact that policy needs that for that catch up to happen, policy needs to specifically target the informal sector manufacturing, or even just generally the informal sector. to be able to, because that is the itself that will be that will allow, because what policy normally takes is it's policies that in effect that in effect would allow those farms that are already incumbent farms to already thrive. So we need more other specific policy targets for these farms that are already informal in nature, but that target these workers to be able to raise their productivity. And that in itself is something that needs a little bit more of thinking and a little bit more of participation from other people. The second question you've asked about is a question of export promotion zones or special economic zones. So, and this is, I want to give a political economy answer, which is government has already raised through policy, raised the cost of doing business or manufacturing. Then government goes back and says, because the cost is high, let's isolate specific areas to isolate specific areas to allow that form of manufacturing to take place, that manufacturing to take place. But what government is dishing out is just economic rents, and that in itself. So I agree. Part of the policy, land is not a big policy problem in Kenya, but public goods like sewer lines, like dependable electricity, like many other things, those are key things that actually electricity lines. So like, for example, so there are many key things that you see that government needs to provide, not to dish out those economic grants. And that essence of equality is something that we even see in that. So it means government needs to think more around, because that raising costs and then on one side be able to adjust is something that, on the VAT question, as we all know from the first principles, is that the VAT is a value added tax. It's supposed to be a tax on value add. But again, Kenya has taken that input output model, which allows offsets. In itself, on paper, it's a very fancy argument. In terms of actual application, it's very difficult to implement. Our view has always been that part of the first level principle is to have a lump sum tax, say 5% or 6%. It's a final tax. It does not discriminate sectors. And it's just something that you don't need to offset. Once it's collected. And then, that's the only way you can have a VAT in Kenya. Or in substitution is to have a sales tax on everything else and then forget entirely about this concept of VAT. Because that input-output model is just a fancy thing on the document. If you look at it, the way even the briefings in May, between May and February from members of parliament, the finance committee, the VAT refunds, even if government, unless the VAT refunds, they stand at 5 billion shillings, close to 5 billion shillings a month. What government has already made provisions for is at 3.5 billion shillings. The law does not give you permission to offset that, even if you've done those prepayments. So that in itself, those are things that the law is just creating serious roadblocks. And then to try and make one sector, say one sector can claim, another sector cannot claim. It's a serious policy distortion. So I agree with you, comment. Part of the thing is to be able to bring clarity and coherence around that tax issue. And this is something that members of parliament have moved it forward, have twinkled with it, but with no results. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks a lot. No other questions here. Thanks, Leo, for that as well. And I've always felt that if the function of SEZ's policy is to make sure that manufacturing grows, and of course with it jobs, then one of the things the government should do is, instead of establishing SEZ zones, why don't we just have a policy that makes the entire Kenya a special economic zone for manufacturing, and then manufacturing farms will actually just choose where to go to. And so if that means reducing some of the costs, fine. If it means making sure infrastructure is available, you try and develop it in a way that does not discriminate by saying that this should happen. And then, of course, farms will choose and the clusters will form naturally. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. This was the 32nd webinar of the Institute of Economic Affairs for this year. And we are trying to discuss the concept of premature deindustrialization. And Leo explained what premature deindustrialization is. It comes in two forms. Manufacturing share of GDP starts to fall, or industrialization, and it starts to fall before a certain level of income is attained. Kenya has the worst of both ends. Basically, it's all falling and falling at a much lower, falling faster than many other countries have experienced, but also falling at a much lower income level than historical levels have shown. It has certain implications for policy, and one of those is, yes, we were clear that we wanted to explain premature industrialization and situating Kenya's place, but there's no silver bullet to this. It just brings us back to one of those things that government has to do. Policy is a very complex environment, and you have certain sets. There are things that government should do. Among them is public goods provision, obviously infrastructure, everything else, management of fiscal policy, management of the exchange rate, and all of those things that are good for the economic performance generally are necessary here. And then the others are industrial policy is difficult to execute properly. Regardless of that, there are certain things government can do. So if you've decided on special economic zones, for instance, the design of taxes at value-adding taxes in Kenya is a mess, to be honest. It's only good for people who do the tax accounting to help farms to make claims. But on the whole, I think it creates a drag on the entire sector and the manufacturing sector in general. We hope we haven't provided a discouraging picture, because what Leo made very, very clear is that the share of manufacturing in GDP has shrunk, but it's because other sectors have grown faster. It's not that the total output in manufacturing has gone down. In fact, there are good shoots telling us that there's a part of Kenyan manufacturing that has very high value addition per person. And then there's a certain part, obviously, mostly in the informal sector. So basically what it's telling us is Kenya's manufacturing problem and the premature deindustrialization is related to, among other things, the fact that the informal sector has grown far too quickly and dominated the formal sector of the market. So the point is, how do we have a happy mix of that? And then finding super performers, which is basically the superstars in Kenya's manufacturing. They probably will be high capital intensive firms, but how do we make sure that it's connected and embedded to other sectors within the economy? The idea of premature deindustrialization as an escalator is one that's being debated quite a bit now. And it's just getting debated as a time in which the World Bank a couple of months ago published a new article talking about government industrial policy. And industrial policy is about government making carefully thought out and cautious choices about what sectors to support with which policy instruments to ensure that growth takes place. The final thing for us at the Institute of Economic Affairs is growth is the ultimate. Growth should be the ultimate focus of governments. Why? Especially for a country where income per capita is not just low, but poverty levels are very high. Solving Kenya's welfare and development problems would require a fast growth rate maintained for almost a generation more. Manufacturing sector, in our view, still has a very, very big role in that, indispensable in our view, given that Kenya is only at less than $3,000 lower middle income share. As we discussed, the next Vision 2060 or Vision 2063, however far I prefer to go, for the IE, it doesn't matter. In fact, that kind of central planning is a bit too complicated in our view. The focus should be growth. And that growth should be, how do we make sure that Kenya develops more of the superstars, but tries to raise the productivity at whatever sectors up towards the level that the manufacturing sector has shown. And as known, manufacturing sector, especially the formal side, has the highest wages in the country among all sectors in Kenya. So we hope we've left you with some questions, provided a few answers. And thank you for being with us at the Institute of Economic Affairs and attending this meeting. We are grateful for that. And please consider being a member of the Institute of Economic Affairs. If you wish to find out how to become a member, please send an email to admin@ieakenya.or.ke, and somebody will send you the forms and provide guidance on how that can happen. And finally, thanks to Leo Kimboi, who's a program officer in the Constitution Law and Economy program of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and who guides and leads their series of conversations and research on Industry254. Thank you very much for being here, and thanks, Leo, for a fantastic presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have another presentation. We'll have another webinar in the course of the week. Please look out at the IEA's website, read our blogs related to this subject and others. But we thank you for being here with us, and do have a good afternoon. Thank you. Oh, yes, I thank our communications team as well, who communicated with all of you, and our IT team, who kept this fairly stable presentation going today, and the infrastructure's worked. So thanks a lot, everyone, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.